Hi and welcome. I'd like to talk to you about fixed costs and variable costs and the difference between the two and how we need to classify costs as either fixed or variable. So, fixed costs, things like rent, salaries, wages, electricity, insurance, interest. Now, those are regarded typically as being fixed because they usually do not change during a financial year, no matter what our sales have been, or the period for which we want to do some calculation. We say, well, certain costs during that period are going to be fixed. But there's some things we need to be aware of. Rent may well be fixed annually in terms of some lease agreement, but there are some lease agreements such as those for premises in shopping malls that require the lessee to pay a percentage of turnover, sales, in addition to a fixed rental amount. Now, the additional amount that you pay to the landlord, which is a percentage of your sales, would then be constituted a variable cost. Salaries, generally regarded as being fixed, as they're only reviewed once annually. Where, however, some employees are paid amounts linked to sales, such as commission, then the commission would be regarded as a variable cost. By the way, here one needs to be careful with commissions. A couple of years back, I was working at a company and somebody told me that they'd started a product range, and to get it really going in the market, they said they would pay a commission to all of their salespeople. The commission was not based on any percentage. It was based on the number of units that they sold. And unfortunately, nobody to check to see at what price they were selling these units. Everybody was celebrating the fact that they'd sold a hell of a lot of units, but they only woke up a month and a half later and realized what had got wrong. All right, wages. Wages used to be regarded as a variable cost. The workforce was increased or decreased according to production requirements at short notice. So this would, for example, happen in the motor industry in Port Elizabeth. I remember in the 60s where hundreds of people could find out on a Friday afternoon, when they got paid, that they were no longer employed. And of course, the decision to make them no longer employed may well only have been taken on the Thursday morning. Now, this could have been because a sudden drop in demand for motor vehicles and they were cutting back on production. But in recent times, due to changes in business attitudes to human resource management, combined with the rise in the bargaining power of trade unions and government legislation, wages have effectively become a fixed cost. However, any incentive paid to workers in, say, in a factory based on production output, that would be separated from the wage bill and treated as a variable cost. Electricity for lighting offices could generally be regarded as being fixed. Electricity consumption in a factory, which varies with output, could be regarded as a variable cost, but it does depend on how the electricity tariff is structured. At home, we are billed for the amount of electricity that we use, so much per unit that we use. But in an industrial situation where the amount of usage may fluctuate from day to day, week to week, depending on production levels, and on some days be extremely high, the billing tariffs are different. They bill on what they call a peak demand basis. Now, the thinking behind this billing, the fixed demand, by the power generator is that if they have to have electricity ready on standby all the time for these factories that sometimes peak their demand very high above the average, then they're going to have to pay for that availability. So essentially you're paying for the availability of electricity when you make a peak demand. Insurance, generally the insurance tariffs we insure motor vehicles, buildings, inventories, everything that we insure, would stay pretty constant throughout the year and would be regarded as a fixed cost. Something could happen though that could cause the premiums to increase during the year. And so we would want to know about that. The reason they might increase is, for example, an insurance on our inventory that we carry. And sometimes in anticipation of big sales, we increase our inventory levels. Therefore, the insurance company would probably require us to declare these increases and then would bill us for additional insurance for that period. So in that case then, if it's dependent in some way on sales, then we may sometimes regard it as being a variable cost. But it would depend on whether it was a material amount, in other words, a significant amount. If it wasn't a large amount, well, we wouldn't bother. One must be careful about interpreting fixed costs as costs that do not change. The view of the cost being fixed is merely that it reflects their anticipated behavior during a time period. So, fixed cost, we don't anticipate any changes. Variable cost, well, depending on volumes that we sell and the commissions payable and any other expenditure that increases because of sales, then that would become a variable cost. But both of the costs we would consider as either fixed or variable when doing calculations about certain projects we're thinking of undertaking in the period ahead. It's also necessary to realize that fixed costs can represent the upper end of our capacity. The capacity to do sales, do admin, and mainly to do production. So once we reach the upper end of that capacity that we're creating or are creating with our fixed costs, then we may well have to do something about it. We may well have to increase the level of resources across the board, renting extra factory space, building extra factory space, things like that could increase the capacity, but that would increase our fixed cost. But once you have increased the fixed cost structure in a business, you're stuck with it. So if you double the size of your factory and the sales that you anticipated don't materialize over the next few years, well, then you're still stuck with that factory, or the increase in the size of the factory. So an ideal business situation would be one where we have no fixed costs and only variable costs. So in other words, if we did no business, we'd have no costs. But that's quite unrealistic to expect. But it's something one can think about.